My sister called me on a Tuesday morning just as I was pouring my second cup of coffee and said 4 words I wouldn't understand until the following afternoon. "Tell Daniel you're broke." She didn't explain. She laughed it off when I pressed her, said it was just a bit of fun, said I was overthinking things the way I always did, the way I'd always done, even as a little girl, checking the locks twice before bed and asking too many questions at the dinner table. I believed her. I laughed along, a little embarrassed by my own suspicion, and went back to my perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, was that those 4 words were the only warning I was ever going to receive. Because by the following evening, I would be sitting on the cold ceramic tile of my own kitchen floor, back pressed against the cabinet under the sink, knees pulled up to my chest, staring at a stack of documents that proved my husband and his mother had been quietly, methodically, patiently dismantling everything I had built over the last decade. And my sister, my blood, my best friend since we were sharing a bedroom and trading secrets under the covers, had known about it for weeks and said nothing. Nothing except those 4 strange words on a Tuesday morning that I had laughed off like a fool. My name is Clara. And at 34 years old, I thought I had finally, genuinely earned the right to feel safe. That word, safe, sounds so simple when you say it out loud, but for someone who grew up the way I did, with a father who disappeared when I was 9 and a mother who worked double shifts at the hospital until her feet bled, safety was never a given. It was something you built, one careful brick at a time, with your own hands and your own money and your own stubborn refusal to depend on anyone who hadn't yet proved they deserved to be depended on. I had carried that belief through 2 universities, 3 jobs, and 4 apartments before I finally sat across from a mortgage officer at 30 years old and signed my name on a document that made something real and solid and permanent mine. Our house on Mercer Street was the physical proof of everything I'd worked for. I'd bought it 4 years earlier, before Daniel and I were even engaged, when I was still just a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown, carefully saving every spare dollar in a separate account I called, privately and with no small amount of pride, the mine account. The house was a 1940s craftsman bungalow with original hardwood floors and a porch that wrapped around the front and half the left side, and I had fallen in love with it so completely at the first showing that I'd made an offer before leaving the driveway. The mortgage was in my name alone. I'd been very deliberate about that, not out of distrust, or at least that's what I told myself at the time, but out of a quiet, bone-deep instinct that some things needed to belong entirely to you and no one else. The morning my sister called, I was standing in that kitchen in the golden October light, the kind of autumn light that turns everything the color of honey and makes even ordinary things look like they've been carefully arranged by someone who loves you. The coffee maker was gurgling its last few drops into the pot. There was a vase of sunflowers on the counter that Daniel had bought at the farmer's market on Saturday, their heavy heads drooping slightly in that cheerful, defeated way sunflowers always droop by day 4. The radio was on low, some morning show where 2 people laughed too easily and too often. I was wearing my husband's old college sweatshirt over my work blouse because the mornings had turned cold and I always ran late getting dressed in October. It was the kind of morning that, looking back on it now, I would give almost anything to return to. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was still innocent. I still lived inside it. I still believed in it completely. Daniel and I had been married for 2 years, together for 4. He was a civil engineer, patient, methodical, the kind of man who actually read the instruction manual before assembling furniture and who kept a running grocery list on the refrigerator door updated with magnetic letters. He was not, by anyone's definition, a dramatic person. He laughed quietly, argued rarely, and had a habit of touching the back of my hand with 2 fingers when he wanted to say something kind and didn't quite have the words. I had loved him for those 2 fingers against the back of my hand more than I could ever properly explain. His mother, Renata, was another matter entirely. Renata was 61 years old and had the posture of a woman who had spent decades believing she was the most important person in any room she entered. She was tall, silver-haired, meticulously dressed in that particular way that signals money without quite spending it. Cashmere in neutral tones, pearl earrings, leather shoes with low-block heels that clicked on hard floors with a rhythm that I had, over the years, learned to dread. She smiled frequently and warmly at people she needed, and never quite fully at anyone else. She had been widowed when Daniel was 15 and had raised him, as she told anyone who would listen, entirely alone, entirely by myself, with no help from anyone. I had heard this sentence so many times that I had quietly cataloged all 23 words of it as a kind of alarm bell. Whenever it appeared, some request or comparison or subtle redirection of loyalty was coming, dressed up as a statement of fact. She had never been overtly cruel to me. I want to be precise about that. She had never said anything I could point to plainly and say, "There. That is the moment she declared war." It was subtler than that. The way she sometimes looked at our house with an expression that landed halfway between appreciation and appraisal. The way she asked about my salary not with curiosity, but with a careful cataloging attention that made me feel like a number being entered into a spreadsheet I wasn't allowed to see. The way she referred to the house, occasionally and almost casually, as the family house, as if saying it enough times might eventually make it true. I had always filed these things under quirks of a difficult woman and moved on, because that is what you do when you love your husband and you want your life to be peaceful. The first strange thing happened about 3 weeks before my sister's phone call, on a Sunday when Renata had come for her usual weekly dinner. I had made roast chicken and roasted potatoes with rosemary, the kitchen smelling warm and herby and good, and Daniel had opened a bottle of wine that had been sitting on top of the refrigerator for months, waiting for a reason. It felt like a pleasant evening, the ordinary kind of pleasant that comes from routine and familiarity and knowing exactly where everyone is supposed to sit. And then, between the main course and the apple tart I'd bought from the bakery on the corner, Renata set down her wine glass, looked at me with that particular smile that lived only on the lower half of her face, and asked, in a tone so light it could have been mistaken for small talk, whether Daniel and I had updated our wills recently. I looked at Daniel. He was cutting his chicken with unnecessary precision and did not look up. "We haven't, actually," I said, keeping my voice equally light, matching her register the way you match someone's walking pace. "We keep meaning to get around to it." Of course," Renata said, and lifted her wine glass again. "I only ask because a friend of mine, you don't know her, Elena, lovely woman, her husband passed quite suddenly last year, and there was such a mess with the property. The house, specifically. It's just so important to have everything in order, especially with a property like this one." She paused and let her gaze drift briefly, appreciatively around my kitchen. "It would be a shame for something like that to become complicated." I smiled back at her and said that she was absolutely right and that we'd look into it. Daniel said nothing. He was still focused on his chicken, which by that point he had cut into pieces so small they barely needed chewing. Later, washing up, I mentioned to him that his mother had seemed oddly interested in the house and he dried a plate very carefully and said I was reading too much into it, that she was just being practical, that she always worried about these things since his father died. She means well, he said, which was a sentence I had heard him say about his mother so many times that it had lost all specific meaning and become instead a kind of conversational full stop. A door, gently but firmly being closed. I let it go. The plate went back in the cabinet. The kitchen went quiet. The sunflowers on the counter were fresh then, newly bought, still pointing straight up toward the ceiling. The second strange thing happened the following week, over the phone. I was at work, halfway through a quarterly report, when my sister Mia called during her lunch break, which she almost never did, because Mia was a third-grade teacher with 22 children who collectively treated lunch break as a competitive sport. I answered on the second ring because anything from Mia during school hours usually meant something had actually happened. But she sounded fine, breezy even, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing. Our mother's upcoming birthday, a film she'd seen on streaming, whether I had a good recipe for pumpkin soup. And then, just before she hung up, she said something that landed oddly, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise familiar song. "Hey," she said, her voice dropping just a fraction. "Has Renata been asking about your finances lately? Like, specifically your finances?" I pulled back from the computer screen and turned my chair slightly toward the window. "Kind of," I said slowly. "Why? Did Daniel say something to you?" No, Mia said quickly. Too quickly. "Never mind, forget I said it. I was just curious. Hey, how are the sunflowers?" I told her they were fine. She said goodbye. I sat looking at my open quarterly report for a full 3 minutes before I could remember what column I'd been filling in. The question sat in the corner of my mind like a small stone in a shoe. Not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore once you'd felt it. Had Renata been asking about my finances? I turned back through the last few weeks and found, with something that felt almost like vertigo, that yes, she had asked 3 separate times in the past month, in 3 different ways, none of them quite direct enough to challenge. Once about whether my company offered a good pension plan, once about whether the market was treating my investments well, once about whether Daniel and I were thinking about refinancing. 3 questions, 3 different conversations, each one drifting away before I could look at it properly. I closed the quarterly report. I stared out the office window at the city below, at the traffic moving in its slow, indifferent way, 10 floors underneath me. I told myself what Daniel had told me. I was reading too much into it. She meant well. She always worried. I was the kind of person who saw patterns where there were none, who built mountains out of the small, sharp rubble of ordinary life. That was my flaw, wasn't it? Mia had always said so, kindly and often. So I breathed out, picked up my pen, and went back to my quarterly report. I realize now, the very last person to understand what was already in motion. My sister called on a Tuesday. It was, as I said, entirely ordinary in its beginning. The coffee, the golden light, the drooping sunflowers, the radio murmuring in the background. I had my phone propped between my ear and shoulder because I was simultaneously trying to find the lid to my travel mug, which had a habit of migrating to the back corner of the top cabinet where I couldn't reach it without a chair. Mia was telling me about a parent-teacher evening she'd had the night before. Some father who'd insisted his son's difficulties with long division were a result of the classroom being painted the wrong shade of yellow, and I was laughing with real, uncomplicated warmth, the way you only laugh at things that happen to someone else, when she stopped mid-sentence and said it. Clara. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed a stranger, but I had known Mia's voice for 34 years, and I felt the shift the way you feel a drop in air pressure before a storm, a tightening, a closing. Listen, I need to tell you something, but I can't. I can't tell you the whole thing. Not yet, but just... She paused. I heard her breathe. Tell Daniel you're broke. I came down off my toes with the travel mug lid finally in my hand and stood flat-footed in the middle of the kitchen. What? Just pretend. If he asks about money, if he brings it up, just tell him things are tight, that your savings are low, that you've had some unexpected expenses. Another pause. Her voice had gone very careful, the way you go careful when you're trying to say exactly the right amount and nothing more. Can you just do that for me? For now? Mia, what are you talking about? What's going on? Nothing. It's nothing. I'm probably being stupid. Just promise me, okay? Just for a little while. And then, before I could push any further, she said the sunflower thing and laughed and was gone. And I was standing in the kitchen with the travel mug lid in my hand and a silence that had somehow become heavier than the conversation that had filled it 30 seconds before. I stood there for longer than I should have. The radio was playing something soft and irrelevant. A car went past outside, its tires rasping on the wet leaves that had begun to collect against the curb. I turned Mia's words over in my mind like a coin I couldn't identify. Unfamiliar weight, unfamiliar face, and could not make sense of them. Tell Daniel you're broke. Why? What possible reason could there be for my husband to think I had no money? What possible reason could there be for Mia to want him to think that? And why, most importantly, why couldn't she tell me the whole thing? The words, "not yet," implied a later, a fuller explanation that would come when some condition had been met, some timing had aligned. The words, "not yet," implied she was waiting for something, or protecting me from something, or protecting someone else. And that last possibility was the one I kept flinching away from because I didn't want to look at what it might mean. I put the lid on the travel mug. I picked up my bag. I drove to work and spent 8 hours being competent and focused and completely unable to stop a quiet, persistent current of unease from running underneath everything I did. By the time I drove home that evening, the unease had settled into something denser. A cold, formless weight in my chest that I told myself was nothing, told myself was the result of not eating lunch properly, told myself was Mia being Mia, dramatic and well-intentioned and probably wrong. Daniel was not home when I arrived. He'd texted at 4 to say he'd be late, a site meeting that was running over, not to wait for him for dinner. I made pasta, ate it standing at the counter looking out at the backyard where the last of the summer's tomato plants were dying gracefully in their beds. I washed the bowl. I folded laundry. I did all the small, tactile things that fill an empty house with the sensation of usefulness. And then, because Daniel's laptop was sitting open on the kitchen table where he'd left it that morning, because I was passing it on my way to refill my glass of water, because I was not looking for anything and had no particular reason to look. I glanced at the screen. The laptop had not gone to sleep. The browser was open to what looked like a document, a PDF, or something formatted like one. White background and black text, and a heading that I registered before I'd properly decided to read it. I stopped walking. I set my glass down on the counter without looking. I took 3 steps back to the table and stood in front of the screen and read the heading a second time, more slowly, as if reading it slowly might change what it said. It said, "Transfer of beneficial interest, residential property, Below that, in the standard gray subtext of a legal document, 23 Mercer Street, my address, my house. I don't remember deciding to sit down, but I was suddenly in the chair, the one Daniel usually used, the hard wooden one with the slight wobble in its back left leg that we'd always meant to fix. My hands found the edges of the laptop and tilted the screen toward me, and I began to read. And as I read, something in my body began to happen that I have never found exactly the right words for. It was not pain precisely, and it was not cold precisely, though it felt like both. It was more like the sudden total removal of a foundation I had not known I was standing on. The floor was there, but something underneath it was gone, and I was perfectly still on the surface, while everything below me fell away into nothing. The document was a draft. At the top of the page, in the margin, someone had typed in red text, Revelation 3, waiting on Clara's signature block, confirm with R Renata. The document itself was a transfer of beneficial interest. I knew what that meant. I was a financial analyst. I had spent 10 years reading documents like this. I knew precisely, clinically, what the words were saying. It was a legal instrument designed to transfer the financial benefits of property ownership from one person to another while leaving the title unchanged. In plain language, whoever held this document could receive the income or proceeds from a property sale without being the named owner. In plainer language, it was a mechanism for stripping me of the financial value of my own home without necessarily taking my name off the deed, without me knowing, without my consent. My name appeared in the document 3 times, each time as the transferring party, each time above a signature line that was, in this draft, still blank. And at the bottom of the final page, under the heading Receiving Party, was a name I recognized, not Renata. I had half prepared myself for Renata. Some cold and functional part of my brain had already begun assembling that particular horror. But it was not Renata's name. It was Daniel's. My husband's full legal name, in the clean official typeface of a law firm letterhead, as the sole beneficiary of the transfer of financial interest in our home, the home that I had bought alone, before we were married, in my name with my money, from the mine account. I had built one careful dollar at a time across 7 years of discipline and sacrifice and stubborn, solitary self-reliance. I sat with that for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a dog was barking 2 streets over, short and periodic and unconcerned. The sunflowers in the vase. They were on their 5th day now, and the largest one had bent entirely sideways overnight, its heavy yellow head resting against the glass as if it had simply given up trying to hold itself upright. I remember looking at it and thinking, with a strange, dissociated clarity, I should have thrown those out yesterday. My hands were shaking by the time I thought to scroll up. At the top of the browser was the email in which the document had arrived. It was from an address I didn't recognize, a law firm, Whitmore and Associates, which I made a mental note of with the automatic precision of someone who does not yet know what they will do with information, but understands instinctively that they will need it. The email was addressed to Daniel. The subject line was, M Street, Rev 3. As discussed with your mother, as discussed with your mother. Those 4 words sat in my vision like something burned in. As discussed with your mother. Not as a surprise to her, not something he'd mentioned in passing. As discussed. A collaboration. A plan. I closed the laptop. I walked to the window. I stood there with my hands pressed flat against my thighs, fingers spread. the way you press your hands against something solid when you need to prove to yourself that solid things still exist. The backyard was dark, just the pale shapes of the dying tomato plants and the wooden garden chair I'd painted white last spring sitting at its familiar angle under the oak tree. I had planted that oak tree as a sapling when I moved in. It was barely taller than me then. It was now taller than the house. I heard Daniel's car in the driveway at 9:47. I heard the engine cut, the door open, the specific soft thud of it closing that I had heard 10,000 times and had never particularly noticed because it was just the sound of my husband coming home, the sound of the end of the day, the sound of ordinary life arranging itself into its ordinary pattern. I heard his key in the front lock. I heard him set his bag down in the hallway the way he always did. I heard him call my name in that easy, routine way that meant nothing was wrong in his version of the evening. In his version of this entire year, apparently, nothing had been wrong at all. I didn't answer. I stayed at the window. He found me there after a moment. I heard him come into the kitchen, heard the pause when he noticed the room was dark except for the small light above the stove, heard the slight shift in his footsteps as he moved toward the lamp on the counter and switched it on. "Hey," he said, "you okay? Why are you standing in the dark?" I turned around. I looked at my husband, his familiar face, the slight tiredness around his eyes that came from late-sight meetings, the jacket he always wore in October because he ran cold, the two fingers that hung loosely at his side that had once, in another life that felt approximately 100 years ago, pressed against the back of my hand with extraordinary gentleness. And I looked at all of it and said nothing for long enough that his expression began, very slowly, to change. "Clara," he said, "what's wrong?" "I opened your laptop," I said. My voice came out very level and very quiet. I had expected it to shake. It did not shake. It was the voice of someone who has already moved past the part where you shake and into the part where you become, against your own will, absolutely still. I wasn't looking for anything. I was walking past and the screen was open. He said nothing. His hand, I noticed, had moved slightly. The fingers no longer loose at his side, now pressed flat against his thigh in almost exactly the same position mine had been in 10 minutes earlier, standing at this same window. I noted that. I filed it away. "The document was on the screen," I said. "The transfer of beneficial interest, the one from Whitmore and Associates, the one your mother helped you draft." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that kitchen, louder than any argument, louder than any voice, louder than the refrigerator and the dog down the street and the car that passed outside just at that moment, its headlights sweeping briefly across the far wall like a searchlight, finding nothing worth stopping for. Daniel stood in my kitchen with his jacket still on and looked at me and said nothing, and in that nothing, in the exact quality and texture and shape of that nothing, I understood everything I needed to understand about what kind of husband he had been and what kind of wife I had been willing to be. He didn't deny it. That is the thing I return to, even now. He didn't say, "What document?" or "I don't know what you're talking about," or any of the things an innocent person says when they are blindsided by an accusation. He just stood there with his hand pressed flat against his thigh and looked at the floor between us, and that was its own kind of confession, quiet, cowardly, and complete. "I think," I said, still in that very level voice that did not belong to me at all, "you should explain this to me." And that was when he said the sentence that I have replayed more times than I can count since that evening, the sentence that collapsed his carefully maintained architecture of silence into a pile of words so inadequate that they almost made me pity him. He said, "Clara, I only wanted everyone to be okay." "Everyone," I repeated. The word sat in the air between us like something that had been placed there deliberately, an exhibit, a piece of evidence on a table. "Who is everyone, Daniel?" He moved then, finally, as if the word had released him from whatever frozen place he'd been standing in, and pulled out the kitchen chair, the one beside his usual one, not his own, as if he didn't feel entitled to his own place anymore. He sat down heavily and put both hands on the table, flat, and stared at them. I remained standing. I had not moved from the window. I did not want to sit, did not want to occupy the same horizontal plane as this conversation, wanted the geometry of the room to reflect exactly what was true, that I was above this, already, even if every nerve in my body was screaming otherwise. "She needed," he started, then stopped. "She has debts, Clara, that I didn't know about until about a year ago, significant ones. From when she refinanced the old house to pay for my brother's, it doesn't matter. She needed money and she didn't have it, and she came to me, and I didn't know what to do." He looked up at me then, just briefly, and the expression on his face was something I had never seen on him before. It was not remorse exactly. It was the particular look of a person who has spent a long time constructing a private justification for something and is only now, in the clean, unforgiving light of being caught, beginning to feel the gaps in it. I thought if the house were used as collateral, essentially, just as collateral, she could get a loan against the future value and we could— "It is not a collateral arrangement," I said. "I read the document, Daniel. A transfer of beneficial interest is not a collateral arrangement. It transfers the financial proceeds of a sale. If I sold this house tomorrow under that document, the money would go to you, not me. To you, to service her debts." I watched his face while I said this, and I watched him not disagree, not argue, not correct a single word I'd said. "How long?" I asked. "About 11 months, he said. 11 months. I did the arithmetic involuntarily, the way you do when a number is given to you that you need to make real. 11 months ago, it had been November. We had just come back from a weekend trip to the coast. I had a photograph of the two of us on that trip somewhere in my phone, his arm around me, the sea behind us, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. 11 months of planning, 11 months of dinners and conversations, and 2 fingers against the back of my hand, and she means well, and you're reading too much into it. All of it a surface, a performance, a very convincing facsimile of a life. While underneath it, this document was being drafted and revised again. Revision 3, like a piece of work product, like a project that required care and attention and multiple rounds of refinement. "Does anyone else know?" I asked. A pause. Fractional, but real. "Mia found out," he said, 2 weeks ago. She overheard something at Mum's birthday dinner. We didn't know she'd heard until she confronted me about it last week." He stopped. "I asked her to give me time to tell you myself. She agreed, but I think she was trying to give you a warning in her own way, without actually breaking her word to me." "Tell Daniel you're broke." I heard it again in Mia's voice, dropped low and careful, carrying the weight of something she knew and couldn't say directly. She had been protecting me the only way she could without betraying the promise she'd made. A promise made to the wrong person, extracted under false premises, but a promise she had still tried to honor, while simultaneously trying to save me. I felt a rush of something complicated for my sister in that moment. Grief and gratitude so tangled together, I couldn't separate them. Why? I asked, and I meant it broadly. Not just the document, not just the mechanics of the plan. Why? The whole of it. Daniel was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. I waited. She told me she would cut me out, he said finally, and his voice had gone very small. If I didn't help her. She said she had a will and she could change it, and if I didn't find a way to fix her situation, she would. He stopped, pressed his hands harder against the table. I know how that sounds. It sounds, I said slowly and precisely, like you decided your inheritance was worth more than my home. He didn't say anything. He did not have to. I left him sitting at the kitchen table and went upstairs and closed the bedroom door, not slamming it, I was past slamming, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. My phone was in my hand. For a long time, I did nothing with it. I sat with the weight of the evening settling into its proper shape, organizing itself into the categories of a life that had just been cleanly bisected into before and after. Before I walked past the laptop. After. The world before had been built on something I had thought was solid, and the world after was this. A bed in a dark room, a phone in my hand, the quiet, persistent sound of my own breathing, which was steadier than I had any right to expect. I thought about Renata. I thought about the specific, practiced warmth of her voice when she asked about the house. I thought about the family house, said softly, almost accidentally, over the roast chicken and the decent wine. I thought about the wills conversation, the pension conversation, the refinancing conversation, each one a small, careful probe, feeling for the edges of what I knew, what I suspected, how well defended I was. I thought about, as discussed with your mother in the subject line of a legal email, and I thought about Whitmore and Associates, and I thought about Revelation 3, which implied a Revelation 1 and a Revelation 2, which implied meetings and phone calls and hours of careful planning, none of which I had been present for, all of which had been conducted in the margins of my ordinary trusting life. The ice that moved into me then was not the ice of grief. It was something else entirely, colder and more purposeful, and I realized with a kind of dark surprise, almost clarifying. I had read once, somewhere, about the difference between hot anger and cold anger, how hot anger is wild and immediate and burns itself out, and cold anger is precise and patient and tends to know exactly what it wants. I had never been a cold anger person. I had always been the hot kind, quick to flare, quick to forgive, quick to move on and believe the best. Something had shifted in me permanently in the last 45 minutes, and I could feel the shift in the quality of my own stillness, the way you feel a bone that has reset slightly differently than it was before. Functional, possibly stronger, never quite the same. I opened my phone. I called my father. He answered on the second ring, which was the usual. My father slept lightly and had, since I was a child, treated late-night phone calls from either of his daughters with the immediate, uncomplaining attention of someone who has decided that nothing his children might need at midnight constitutes an imposition. I told him, in a few brief and very accurate sentences, what I had found. He listened without interrupting, which was also the usual. When I finished, there was a short silence, and then he said, "Do you have a photograph of the screen?" I hadn't. I went back downstairs where Daniel was still at the table, and I opened the laptop without looking at my husband, and I photographed every page of the document with my phone. Daniel watched me do this and said nothing, which was becoming a pattern so complete it had achieved a kind of terrible coherence. A man so practiced in not acting that he had made inaction into an identity. "Clara," he started. "Don't," I said, "just that. One word." He closed his mouth. My father called back at 7 the next morning with the name of a property litigation attorney he trusted, a woman named Frances Adair who had, he said, handled exactly this kind of case before and who had agreed to speak with me that afternoon. I had slept 4 hours in the guest room with the door locked and woken up with the specific, stripped clarity of someone who has grieved the easy version of their life overnight and is now ready to live the real one. The meeting with Frances Adair lasted 2 hours. She reviewed the photographs I'd sent her ahead of time, asked me 27 questions that were precise and comprehensive, and gave me the bracing sensation of being properly taken seriously for the first time in what felt like a long time. She told me several things. First, because the document was a draft and bore no actual signature, it had no legal force. Second, because it had been drafted with the clear intent of depriving me of the financial value of property I solely owned, it potentially constituted fraud, specifically financial fraud against a spouse, which, depending on how the evidence developed, could involve both civil and criminal liability. Third, because the document referenced Renata explicitly and had been drafted as discussed with your mother, Renata's involvement was documented in the instrument itself. I sat across from Frances Adair's desk in her glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with the October city spread out behind her, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Tuesday morning, the returning sensation of solid ground. "What I'd like to do first," I told Frances, "is speak to Renata directly, before anything is filed. I want to be in a room with her, and I want her to know that I know everything." Frances looked at me steadily. "That's your right," she said. "I'd advise you to let me be present, or at least to record the conversation where legally permissible." "I know," I said. "I will." Renata arrived at our house on Saturday morning, which was where I had asked her to come, because I wanted this conversation to happen in my house, on my floors, under my ceiling, in the space that she had spent 11 months trying to take from me without my knowledge or consent. She wore gray cashmere and pearl earrings, and her block heels clicked on the hardwood in the hallway the way they always clicked, steady and assured, and she came into the kitchen and looked at me with that lower face smile and said, "Clara, darling, Daniel said you wanted to talk. Is everything all right?" "Sit down, Renata," I said. Something in my voice made her pause. The flatness of it, perhaps, the total absence of the small social warmth she was used to from me. She sat. Daniel was standing near the door to the hallway, not quite in the room. My father was seated at the far end of the table, which I had told Renata he would be, and which she had apparently agreed to without objection, perhaps not yet understanding what kind of conversation this was. I put my phone on the table between us, screen up, and opened the photographs of the document. "I want you to look at this," I said. "And then I want you to tell me, please, in your own words, what this is." She looked at it. The lower face smile did not move immediately. It held its position for a moment longer, like an actor who hasn't received the cue to exit yet. And then it dissolved, slowly, from the edges inward, leaving something underneath that was rawer and harder, and much more honest than anything I had seen on her face in the 4 years I had known her. She looked at the document for 6 seconds. Then she looked up at me. "Clara?" she said, and her voice had shifted register entirely. Lower, more careful, stripped of its social warmth. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There has not," I said. "Daniel and I were simply exploring options." "You drafted a legal instrument," I said, "to transfer the financial proceeds of my property to your son in order to service your debts without my knowledge or consent. That is not an exploration of options. That is fraud." I said the word cleanly and without heat. I had practiced saying it the night before, alone in the guest room, because I wanted to say it correctly. Not as an accusation delivered in anger, which could be deflected, but as a fact stated plainly in the same tone you might use to note that it was raining. I have spoken to a property litigation attorney. I have documented copies of the draft. I have the email correspondence showing your involvement. And if this document is ever presented to me in any form for any purpose, I will file a civil complaint naming both you and Daniel within 24 hours. The kitchen was very still. My father sat at the end of the table with his hands folded on its surface and said nothing. He had, I noticed, brought a small notebook, which was sitting closed beside his folded hands. He had not opened it. He did not need to. His presence was its own complete statement. Renata looked at Daniel. It was the most honest thing she'd done since she sat down. A naked, unguarded look of appeal, the look of someone reaching for a lifeline they have always been able to rely on. And Daniel, to my permanent and complicated surprise, did not reach back. He looked at the floor. He pressed his hands flat against his thighs. And Renata, for the first time in a kitchen that her plan had always intended to own, had nothing to hold. "I was trying to help my family," she said, and her voice had lost its smoothness and become something thinner and almost fragile underneath. "After everything I sacrificed." "I'm going to stop you there," I said quietly. "I am not interested in what you sacrificed. I am interested in what you plan to take." I reached forward and turned the phone screen off. "I think you should leave now." She left. The heels clicked down the hallway and the front door opened and closed, and the sound of them was gone, and the kitchen settled back into itself. The refrigerator, the light, the oak tree visible through the back window with its solid trunk and its high, indifferent branches. The divorce proceedings began 3 weeks later. I will not dwell on them at length because they were, in their mechanics, exactly as miserable as divorces are. But I will say this. Frances Adair was formidably good at her job, and the documented evidence of Daniel's involvement in the draft transfer was sufficient to ensure that the settlement negotiations moved with a speed and decisiveness that might otherwise have taken years. Daniel did not contest the house. I don't know whether this was guilt or practicality or both, and I have reached the point of not particularly needing to know. He moved out in November into an apartment across the city. Renata's debt situation, once her plan had collapsed, became a matter she was left to resolve without the financial architecture she had spent 11 months building in my kitchen. My father told me months later that she had sold her car. He said it without particular satisfaction, and I received it the same way. Mia and I had a long, difficult conversation on the Sunday after the Saturday confrontation, sitting on the porch in the cold November air with blankets over our legs and 2 cups of tea that went cold between us. She told me everything, how she had overheard the conversation at Renata's birthday dinner, the exact words, how she had confronted Daniel and how he had begged her for time, how she had tried to warn me without breaking her word and had failed, essentially, to do either thing fully. She cried. I held her hand. I was not entirely without anger toward her. I think I held some of it for a long time, folded away in a pocket I didn't often open. But it was small compared to everything else, and it softened across the following months into something that no longer had an edge. The sunflowers I replaced, weekly, then every 2 weeks, then whenever I felt like it, which turned out to be often because I liked having something alive and bright and unambiguous in the kitchen, something that required nothing of me except a glass of water and a little light. That is where I am now, 7 months later, on a warm May morning with the kitchen window open and the oak tree in full leaf in the backyard and the garden coming back to life in its slow, determined way. I have repainted the hallway the color I wanted it when I first moved in, a deep, warm terracotta that Renata had once suggested was a little much. I have moved the kitchen table to the better position, the one by the window where it catches the morning light in a way that makes everything on it look considered and intentional. I have learned, slowly and with some difficulty, the particular quality of silence that a house holds when it belongs to you completely. Not the heavy silence of something missing, but the easy, settled silence of something that has found its right proportion. I think about Mia's phone call sometimes, the 4 words she managed to give me in the only way she could. Imperfect, partial, ultimately not quite enough to stop what had already been set in motion, but real and given with love, and the best she could do inside a situation that should never have required her to choose. I think about the document on the screen and my hands on the table and the cold tile floor and Daniel's voice saying, I only wanted everyone to be okay. And I think about all the things I used to believe were solid that turned out to be performances of solidity, and all the things that turned out to be truly, load-bearingly solid that I had never thought to question. My father's notebook sitting untouched on the table, Mia's voice going careful on the phone, Francis Adair's 27 questions, the oak tree in the backyard that I planted when it was barely taller than me and that now stands indisputably taller than the house. The sunflowers on the counter are fresh. Their heads are straight and heavy and pointing up. The coffee is ready. The morning is mine.